Hi there, everybody. I'm Teresa Bedurk, and I'm the Urban Horticulture Extension Agent here in Pinellas County. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. Whoops. I promise I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And so not only do I run the Urban Horticulture program here in Pinellas County, which is housed at the Botanical Gardens, the same place as the Parks Office, but I also train, recruit, and coordinate the Master Gardener volunteers here in Pinellas County. So if you ever have any questions about plants or Master Gardeners or insects in your landscape, I'm your person. And for some reason, it's not doing presentation mode. There we go. All right, so today we are here to talk about planning a fall garden, and the reason being, it's June. What is it? June 16th, sorry. The reason being is that it's really, really hot outside. I don't have to tell you guys, there's a heat advisory actually that came out for today. Right now until like 6 o'clock at night, they said that the heat index could reach over 110. And so that is one main reason why we talk about fall vegetable gardening now and not summer, because there are very few things that you can grow in the summertime here in Florida with success. And it's also just not all that pleasant to be outside. So we really focus on getting ready for the fall garden season. The reason we're here today, like Jane mentioned, is that gardening is excellent for your wellness. It's great exercise. It's a great reason to get outside, get fresh air, get vitamin D from the sun. And, you know, by the way, get some fresh food out of it. And she mentioned, we were talking just briefly before the talk about, you know, most of us don't have the room to have an entire farm and support all of our produce needs, but we can grow some small things to supplement that, to save a little bit of money. And frankly, the fresh stuff tastes better. So it's still worth it. Timing wise, the best way to remember the vegetable garden season here in Florida is it basically aligns with the school year calendar. Kids go back to school in August, and that's about when we can start planting things. And then that school goes through May, and usually by May, late May, most of our crops have been harvested, and at that point the bugs and the humidity are too high. So something to think about. What we're going to talk about today is kind of the general tips of how to plan where you'd put your garden and how you would prep your soil, what things you can grow in the fall, and that sort of thing. So number one, you've got to have the right location. Obviously it needs to be near the house. So if you have just a small patio, it's going to be pretty easy to make that happen. But if you have a larger yard, you want to be really careful to place it somewhere where you're going to see it all the time. So if your ideal location is a side yard that nobody ever goes in, the odds are you're going to, out of sight, out of mind, right? You're going to forget to look at it. You're going to forget to visit it. And so unless you're sure you're going to remember that, that can be difficult. The other reason I mention that is a lot of people garden in community gardens, which is fantastic, and they are all over the county. Many cities have them, but you need to make sure that it's either near your home or that it's on maybe a regular route to and from work, because you're going to need to interact with that garden, you know, many days a week, some in the early stages, every day for a little while, throughout the year, you know, every other day to every second or third day. So make sure it's convenient. I mentioned that you want to have a good soil, which is funny to me because we don't really have good soil here in Florida. We have sand. So generally speaking, you're going to need to create that soil or to amend your soil. And we'll talk about what we put into it. You need to have water nearby, and that needs to be potable water. So this is water you can drink, is water you can apply in the vegetable garden. So no reclaimed water on the veggies and no rain barrel water on the veggies. Those are great for your ornamental plants though. So still utilize those water sources to save water in the landscape. Just don't apply them to your edibles. Also need a lot of sun. So at least 5 or 6 hours a day. So you look at that picture on the bottom right and really think about where those sunshade patterns are. And we'll talk a little more about that later because that changes seasonally. You also want to avoid tree roots and the trees themselves because of the shade. And if you have septic, you also want to stay away from the septic drain fields or right over top of any of that very expensive equipment. You also need to consider if you need a fence. That fence may be to keep out rabbits. It may be to keep out children and stray soccer balls, your dog. If you live in certain parts of our county, like up around East Lake, Booker Creek Preserve area, you may even need taller fences to keep out deer. So just keep that in mind, who your neighbors are, what's next door, and what might interfere with the garden, because that stray soccer ball that a kid's kicking around can actually cause quite a bit of damage in a vegetable garden. So once you've picked your spot, you've picked the right spot with the right sun and water and everything, there's two options that we have here. Either we're going to plant right in the ground if you have space in the ground, or you're going to plant in a raised bed of some kind, or multiple containers or multiple raised beds. My recommendation, almost always, especially here in Pinellas, is to build raised beds or plant in containers. The reason is many reasons, but mainly because it's sand that we're growing in here. And that sand also contains these little microscopic pests called nematodes. And it's just very difficult to, and darn near impossible to get rid of them. So it's better just to start with clean soil that actually has some organic matter to it, not just sand. Either way, you're going to want at least maybe a month out. So if we're planting in August, you're doing this next month. It's already mid-June. This is July we're talking about. So right now is when you're looking around your house, looking at the sun patterns and thinking, where will I put this? And starting in July, you're going to start placing the beds, doing a little construction, or looking around and clearing the ground. So if you're going to plant in the ground, you need to get everything clear. Like all the weeds need to come up. All the weeds need to come up, which is challenging. And then you're also going to want to till that soil and add in things like compost and manures down to at least about a foot, because the real root space you're looking for with vegetable gardens are going to go about a foot deep. And after you till all that stuff into the soil, you're going to want to collect and do a pH test. And I should have had that. I can share that with you guys at the end. If somebody could remind me to share the soil test link, because that's something you can download. Because pH will determine your success. That's the other reason that I didn't mention why we don't like to plant in the ground here, is many of us have very, very alkaline or very high soil pH. It's a natural occurrence, especially in coastal soils, and sometimes like 7.5 to 8.5. And the vegetable garden really is best around 5.8 to 6.5. So slightly acidic, if anything. So you want to do that. And that takes about a week to 10 days to get your results. So this is why you have to plan so far out in advance. Now, if you build in a raised bed, then you're still going to want to do the same amount of timing, because if you're creating that soil, you're still going to need time to adjust that pH. So let me go to the next slide, because I think it answers some of these questions. Please hold, minor delay. Not sure why. Here we go. So what are these soil amendments I'm talking about that you can add to the add to your soil or add to the raised bed? Those would be compost that you can either create at home or you can buy compost. Rotted leaves. If they're leaves like oak leaves, they might need to be chopped up a little, because oak leaves are very thick and they don't break down easily. You can use grass clippings from your lawn if that is, you don't treat your lawn with anything, herbicides, pesticides that you wouldn't want in the vegetable garden. So for some of us that would work, and some you might want to skip it, especially if you have a lawn service and you don't know what they put down. It's just safer to avoid them. You can also use horse and cow manure, chicken manure, anything that's basically eating plants. All the chickens eat bugs too, that's okay. But you want that manure to already have been composted or aged. So you can buy stuff like this at the store if you don't have easy access to it. Again, most of us don't. So that's the key. But if you do happen to know someone with a horse farm, you just make sure to ask them if it's been aged. And that's usually it's been sitting around for a few months breaking down. It shouldn't smell like manure anymore, basically. It should smell more earthy and like compost rather than like actual manure. You can also use fine mulches. I know, for example, the city of St. Pete actually provides something called mulch fines. It's a very, very, very finely chopped up mulch. You wouldn't want to use large pieces of mulch as a soil amendment. And so these are things that you would want to till into that soil or to use to create that soil and add organic matter to the soil. I have a question here. Actually, we'll talk to that question at the end, so I'll scroll back up. And then at the time of planting, no matter what you do to the soil, we're going to talk about adding a complete fertilizer right at planting time, because vegetables take a lot of nutrients and inputs. It's a little different than the shrubs and the turf grass in your yard. You're taking stuff away from the plants in the form of crops, and so you're removing some nutrients from that natural cycle. If you're going to grow in raised beds or grow boxes, here's some general guidelines, right? They can be almost any size, shape, and whatever your imagination can picture. But most people aim to make them no more than 4 feet wide. And the reason for that is that if I reach my arm across, I need to be able to reach all parts of that bed. And so about 2 feet from either side is about the length that an arm can reach. If you're growing with kids, we usually say about 3 feet just because their arms are shorter. You don't want to be walking up inside that raised bed, because then you're compacting the soil and stepping on plants and all that sort of thing. Most of them are about 5 to 8 feet long, and that's just so you don't have to walk that far around them. They do need to be at least 12 inches high, or 12 inches of soil depth or more. And you watch for this if you're going to buy a kit, because a lot of those garden bed kits do not provide a 12-inch depth. Some of them are as shallow as 6 inches. The 6-inch ones, if they can be stacked, I've done that before. You can buy 2 kits and make a proper depth, but that's just something to look for, is that it's deep enough. Because otherwise, if it's too shallow, you won't be able to grow larger plants like tomatoes and peppers, and that's what a lot of people want to grow. You'd have to stick with more shallow rooted, smaller vegetables, which is doable, but you got to keep that in mind. The bigger the plant, the deeper the root system it's going to have. If you want something that doesn't require bending, or if somebody needs to garden either from a wheelchair or from a chair, maybe they have mobility issues or back issues, then you want to make sure about 24 inches high is a good height for the surface to be at. And there are kits you can buy and pre-made garden beds that you can buy that are raised like that. Some that that they're angled so you can wheel a chair right up to them. So be on the lookout for that if mobility is an issue or bending is an issue. So that's a nice height. And the materials don't matter much. If you are using wood, you need to make sure that it's treated wood, because otherwise it will break down too soon. And make sure that this is the new treated wood. Back in the day, they used to use arsenic when treating wood, which is very hard to find now, and it's probably actually finally broken down in most cases. But if you're to purchase new wood that's treated, they use copper, which is perfectly safe to use in a vegetable garden. So feel free. For smaller spaces, or if you just want to get creative, you can use just about any container that you can think of. The key here is twofold. Number one, make sure you have enough root space. So if the container is too small, it's going to limit you. And you need to make sure that they are drained. So some of these containers that you see, let me see if I took that one out. The containers in the center, that silver water trough container that's planted, you would need to purposely introduce holes into that container. So keep that in mind. I've seen people use things like old canoes and toilet tanks and even bags to grow in. And if you're growing, you just need to make sure that there is proper drainage at the bottom, because otherwise that will fill with water and flood the roots, and your plants will not survive. But feel free to be creative with that. And I've seen some really cool stuff out there. As for what you put into these containers or raised beds, this is the number one question people ask. You can go to the big box store, the garden center, the nursery, and you can buy pre-made mixes, which is easy for the person who waited till the last minute, or you just don't have space to compost or what have you. You can go and buy them. Look for something that is a growing mix, not a potting mix, because potting is for potting up little plants and starting little seedlings. What you want is a growing mix that is for containers or raised beds, and they'll say it on there if it's created specifically for that purpose. Or if you want to do it yourself, you absolutely can. This screen shows you here, and I know Jane's going to send out a PDF of this PowerPoint, so you don't have to write all this stuff down frantically. I guess I should have mentioned that, sorry. You can mix in equal parts, so 1/3 of each, and you have to or you have to put together, how much volume do you need? So you got to do a little calculation on that grow bed. It's 12 feet deep by 4 feet wide by 8 feet long. And there's even some online soil volume calculators you can use. Figure out how many bags and stuff you need, or but you can mix peat moss, or you can substitute coconut coir for peat moss. It's a little more sustainable, so that's something we've been encouraging. Coarse vermiculite and compost. So you can buy, a bag each of those and mix them together, but again, do the math for the volume you need. And that's a great general mix for growing in containers and raised beds. I avoid, especially if you're going to be in a container, avoid digging up a bunch of soil from your landscape, because one of the benefits of growing in a container is to exclude the nematodes that are in the landscape soil. If you dig up soil from the landscape and add it to your raised bed, you're going to introduce nematodes in. And in fact, if you use the same shovel that was out in the landscape, and then you use that same shovel in your raised bed, you can introduce nematodes. And so you're going to want to avoid the mixing of the two, or clean your tools off in between. Another thing to do that's kind of next level, but definitely recommended, would be to line the bottom of that raised bed. So if you have a container, that's easy. Just keep it up off the soil, so little holes, put it on a block so that the roots aren't going to grow out the holes of your container and into the nematode-filled soil. But in a raised bed, the best thing you can do, short of putting a heavy-duty pond liner down, which is very expensive, is to line with several layers of cardboard, which will break down, and eventually the nematodes can be introduced. But for most people, it's the most cost-effective way to kind of get a jump start with fewer nematodes. Our goal here, by the way, is not no nematodes ever, because that's pretty difficult. The goal is to minimize the nematodes. All right, so there is a link at the end on the last slide to this Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide you see a screenshot of. This is a great fact sheet put out by the university. It's probably 10, 12 pages with lots of charts of which vegetables to grow and how to plant them and how far apart to plant them. But this is a great thing to sit down with and come up with your plan. And I definitely recommend that you put a plan on paper. So this does not need to be pretty. It could be a rectangle with little squares drawn on it, and I would say I'm putting beans here, peppers here, tomatoes here, and just come up with an idea. It's just a good way to be sure that you're leaving space for everything and you're growing enough of what you want. The other thing you want to be mindful of is that in the winter, which is a large part of our growing season, y'all know how much earlier the sun sets. Well, the sun is also much lower in that southern sky. And so what happens is the trees cast longer shadows to the north in the winter. So this is something you need to look at. If you are going to put your vegetable garden on the north side of the house, the north side of a tall building, the north side of a tree, what is that sun shade like in the winter? Because that's when you're growing. It may be sunny and bright right now, and it may be very different in the winter time. That's the other nice thing about containers. You can move them if you're wrong. It's happened to me. When you move someplace, you don't always know what the sun is like in the winter if you move there in the summer. So that's really nice. And then a way to avoid shading, having one crop in your garden shade the others, is to keep your tallest crops to the north. And so if you're looking at, obviously, things like your lettuces and carrots are nice and low, you want them at the south end of the garden. And then as you go to the north end of the garden, you think about putting things that are taller, like tomatoes and pepper plants and things like that, so that one does not shade the other. So some ways to put those together and to group those would be, it's mostly important if you're doing crop rotation. So the bigger the garden, the more important this is. Crop rotation in a tiny little container is very difficult because it's just such a small space. You might even just change out the entire container's crop. But you want to group them by their plant families, and that vegetable garden guide I just showed you on the last page, in which you have a link at the end, it actually tells you what plant families each of them are in. So you don't have to be a botanist to know this stuff. And that way, some pests and diseases target certain plant families. And so if you have a terrible disease on your tomatoes one year, if you rotate out to a different plant family, you're going to have less disease pressure and less of that same pest. And so that's what we talk about crop rotation. And these tips are just for how do I arrange the garden besides shade and everything, how else can I arrange stuff? Some other big important tips besides crop rotation and planting by family would also be to put things that take the same amount of time kind of together. So anything that has a really long season and takes 3 or 4 months to grow, to group those together. That way you're not harvesting and pulling out the roots of the shorter season crops in between the longer ones and potentially trampling and disturbing the roots. These are just strategies. And you'll play with this. This is why it's good to have a drawing too, because you can play with this on paper and you say, oh no, I have to do this, but then I wanted to put my tomatoes right next to this, and then I would be stepping on this and ripping this out. You can take your eraser out and start over again. So just things to think about. If you're growing herbs, which is wonderful and a great way to get a lot of impact out of a small space, by the way, because even though you don't make a lot of produce necessarily, you add a lot of good flavor to your food easily. If you're growing a lot of herbs, many of our herbs down here are perennials, meaning they grow growing season after growing season, versus most of our vegetables that are annuals, which we pull out after one season. Group those long perennial or long season herbs together in one area so you're not disturbing those when you rotate and pull out the vegetables. I see a question I can answer here. Karen mentions they had a load of topsoil delivered. Can they use that for planting veggies? I would proceed with caution, shall we say. Topsoil means almost nothing. It could have been anywhere. It could have been from the bottom of a pond that was excavated. It could have been sandy soil from a beach. I would have it tested first to see what the pH level is for sure, but I can also assume that it's full of nematodes. Yeah. So again, it's proceed with caution. I would consider it the same as just in the ground soil. And I assume it's going to need soil pH testing and lots of soil amendments added. All right, so now you've got your plant, you got your spot, right? You have a plan for how you're going to lay it out. Okay, I'm assuming you haven't done this yet, of course. But in the coming weeks, when it's too hot to go outside and you want to sit in the AC and dream about your fall garden. So the next thing, or one of the next things you're going to want to think about is, am I planting from seed or am I planting from transplant? And so a lot of this has to do with timing. And when you guys are done with this and you go look at that veggie garden guide that I will have the link for at the end, it tells you the timing from whether you plant from seed or whether you buy transplants at the garden center. So a lot of that's going to depend. Did you plant early enough? Do you have time to get it in while that window of planting is available? And also budget, because a pack of seeds is anywhere from $1.99 to $3.99 with many, many seeds inside, right? That's pretty budget friendly, to starter plants, which can be anywhere from a couple bucks per plant to $10 per plant, or even more sometimes. So timing and budget, and I'm just going to lay out how you do each of them, but when you guys are coming up with your plan, you'll have to decide what's best for you at that time. Also, some of it will have to do with what's available to you at the store or online when you go to do this. As you guys, I'm sure, are well aware, it seems like supplies of everything are difficult to come by, shall we say? And so that might be part of your planning process. Come up with a plan, check what's available, amend that plan, and then go with the final plan. But if you're going to plant seeds, the good rule of thumb that you guys want to remember is that you're only going to plant that seed about as deep as it is big. So you have wee teeny tiny seeds like the lettuce seeds you see in the top right corner there next to the old penny. You're not really going to dig a big hole to dump those in. You're going to want to just barely cover those with soil, right? They're what, 1/4 of an inch, maybe not even 1/4 of an inch long. And so you're talking about putting 1/4 of an inch of soil at most over top of them. When we do that, we don't try to measure that because that would be difficult. You can either just basically make a small dent, a little tiny furrow, just run your finger or a garden tool in a line where you're going to plant them and sprinkle the seeds gently in that row, lightly dusting the soil on the top. The note there about mixing the seed with builder sand is for people who have trouble manipulating tiny little particles. Sometimes mobility issues might play into this, or if you're working with children, those fine motor skills vary for all of us. And so you can mix it with builder sand, those little bitty seeds, that allows you to just have this sort of granular mix that you can place down. What's going to happen next when you do this method here? You're going to have to come back and thin, because many of those seeds are all in a line, and many of those seeds are going to come up too close together. And don't be afraid of this. Don't be shy about this. You will have a better crop, but you're going to want to go back later and thin those plants out to the proper spacing, because you'll have 3 or 4 of them sometimes growing real close to each other. And so that would be too much competition for space and light and water and nutrients. So you want to thin those out. If the seed is larger, like a bean seed, picture a green bean seed, or even like a lima bean seed that's very big, then you make a hole or a trench in the soil that's about the same depth as the seed, so you can cover it with about that much soil. And that's it. For some reason, this thing is very slow sometimes in changing slides. Okay. You can also grow your own transplants from seeds, which is nice because you can play with the timing. They're basically, you can take little containers, you can be creative, like you see here with the half of a toilet paper tube as starter pots. You can buy starter pots online that you can reuse if you're going to do this year after year. And you're going to keep these, this is where the potting soil comes into play. If you're going to do this, you can start these in potting soil. And it's going to take about 6 weeks to go from seed to that top left corner, the little transplant size plants you see. It's about 6 weeks. And so a lot of people like to do this in July. They get antsy and they get like excited to start the vegetable garden. They want to get a jump start. So a lot of people start these in July, and this goes in a protected area. So not out in the bright sun. This is an area where there is bright but indirect light, like a covered patio, for example, or a carport. That's also good because the heavy rains of summer, if you can imagine, beating down on those little pots would just wash all the soil and seeds up. So you want to start these in a protected area. That list of plants you see on the right is just plants that transplant easily and well. Some do better than others. So these are some examples of popular plants that you can start from seed and transplant yourself. And you can even start seeds at different times, like start a bunch of seeds at 1 week and then wait 2 weeks later and start another one. And the benefit to this, we call this succession planting, is that not everything will be ripe at the same time. So I can imagine you'd rather have peppers and tomatoes and cucumbers or whatever it is you're growing. You know, you don't want 10 pounds of them all at once. You might want a pound of them 1 week and another pound the next week. And so spacing that timing of starting the seeds, this is a cool way to do that, so that you have crops again and again within that time period instead of all at once. Because there's, you know, only so much you can do with 10 pounds of tomatoes, unless you like to can and freeze, which we won't have time to cover. If you do that, you want to handle these very gently when they're ready to transplant. If you can, push up in the bottom of the container. If you can't, squeeze the sides of the container so you can gently slide it out. You want to disturb that little bitty root ball there as little as possible. The small roots that you see are just a fraction of, there's tiny little hair-like roots you can't even see. And every time you touch it and move it, you disturb those, and they take up a ton of water. So to keep your transplant healthy, don't disturb that root ball. Then you're going to dig a little hole that's like a little bit wider, but no deeper. You do not want to plant these any deeper than they were started. So keep it at the same depth and fill it in very gently, pressing the soil. Don't smush it, but make sure there's no air pockets. You're just pressing the soil and water as you go, because watering as you plant will help to fill in those air pockets. Air pockets mean spaces where roots dry out. That's bad. People always ask this because they've heard that you can plant peppers and tomatoes deeper. So if you have like long leggy tomato starts or transplants, tomatoes and peppers are the exception. You can plant those a little bit deeper and they will survive that. But for the most part, you keep your plants at the same depth, because if you bury the root ball, you will smother the root ball. Check my timing here. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're doing good. Okay, so you planted your plants. We can assume maybe you've planted transplants into the garden, and then water. Water is an issue. So the funny thing is we have tons of water in the summer, really too much. And that's one reason why we can't really grow the vegetable garden. Too humid, too much water all at once, right? Like deluges, you guys know what it's like where you get 6 inches in a day. But what happens when it comes to fall, when it's the vegetable gardening season, is oftentimes fall and spring are a bit drier for us. And so that's something we really need to watch. The vegetable garden does need regular water. It doesn't need a ton of water, but you need to be paying attention and needs regular water. So when you have a brand new garden, brand new seeds, you're going to want to water in the morning because morning's always better, like early morning hours, as early as you can. Every day, at least for that first week. And then you're going to start to see a lot of things germinate or sprout. Once the seeds have sprouted, usually by that second week, but that could be different for different crops. Some crops take 2 weeks to germinate. That second week, normally you have most of your seeds sprouted, you can move to every other day. And as the plants get a little bit bigger, then you can move to the every third day, eventually tapering off to about once a week. Now, if you're going in smaller containers, the smaller the container, the faster it's going to dry out. So this rule applies to the ground or large raised beds that have enough soil space. But the smaller containers, you're going to have to check every day. And I got to tell you, if you have a container, small container in a hot patio surrounded by concrete, and it's hot and dry, it may need more than once a day watering. So that you have to keep an eye on. The other solution are those self-watering containers that have a little reservoir in the bottom. Those can work great, but you have to make sure that reservoir stays full, and you have to make sure that the soil at the top stays moist until the plants grow roots, because the roots are what reaches that reservoir and keeps that soil volume moist. The best irrigation, if you're talking a long-term setup, or especially a larger in bed or in-ground or containerized type of bed, would be if you could install drip irrigation. You can buy little drip kits, anywhere from 50 to 100 bucks for a raised bed at the big box stores, and you can make them yourself too. There's all kinds of YouTube videos that are easy. It involves punching little drip emitters, and it's kind of like Legos with tubes. But you can actually do that, and that is best because where you want the water is at the roots. You don't want the water on the leaves because we encourage fungal disease and bacterial problems then. The watering at the roots is easier. And once your plants get big and tall and very leafy in the garden, if you're watering with a hose or a watering can, it's actually more difficult just to reach the roots without getting the leaves wet. So if you can do that, it can be anything from one of those the soaker hoses that you can wind up and down the rows. Those actually work fairly well as long as you protect them from the sun. They do dry out and the rubber cracks and dries out in the sun, but a soaker hose can work really well. Keep in mind that the beginning of the soaker hose has a lot of water pressure. The end of the soaker hose has very little. So keep an eye on those plants near the end of that soaker hose, or maybe run double ones so that the beginning of one is the end of the other, and you get even watering that way. So that's really important. But those seeds need constant moisture to germinate. And when I say constant moisture, imagine a wrung out sponge, not wet and gloopy. If it's drippy and sloppy and gloopy, it's too wet. All right, what about fertilizing those plants? You've got them in the ground. I mentioned at the beginning that at the time of planting, adding a balanced fertilizer is very beneficial. Balance just means that those three numbers you see that stand for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are fairly equal. You're looking at like a 666 or 468 is close enough. A lot of the organics will say things like 324. There'll be a little bit smaller numbers. That's okay. We'll talk about why that's okay and the differences. But you want to broadcast over the whole garden before planting, dig it in a little bit before planting the seeds. And keep in mind, most of you, because you work for the county, are probably pretty savvy about this. We have a fertilizer ordinance in Pinellas County, and we cannot apply nitrogen throughout the summer. So June 1st through the end of September, we can apply nitrogen, that first number, to the landscape. And we can never apply the second number, phosphorus, unless we have a test showing that we are deficient, and then we apply for a permit to apply it. So Here's the thing, in a vegetable garden, you are exempt from that ordinance. And so you can apply those nutrients year round. However, it must be only to those vegetables or in those containers. And the product that you're using has to be labeled for use in a vegetable garden. And again, the vegetables are different because we are constantly taking nutrients from the cycle in the form of our crops and our vegetables and eating them rather than letting them return to the soil like your landscape plants. So this is why they're exempt. Still don't want to over fertilize because you can actually damage the plants and damage the environment, but they need more nutrients than your standard landscape plants. As the plants grow, how often do you fertilize? So generally speaking, it's about every 3 weeks-ish. You're going to watch your plants, but basically when they get to be about 6 inches tall, it's time to apply some more fertilizer. And we have a method that we like to call side dressing, which is just taking a band on one side of the row. So okay, I'm going to go out, I'm going to do a band to the right of each row. So, and then I band the fertilizer. I'm going to read the fertilizer bag and it's going to tell me how much to apply per how many square feet. Again, sorry, there's some math involved. Some people don't like it when I bring that up, but it's minor, it's simple math. And then you apply that on one side. And remember what you did. If you applied to the right side of the rows when you're standing facing, the shed or whatever, then 3 weeks later when you do it, now you're going to do on the left side. And remember that drawing I had you make earlier? Now here's where you can make great notes for the season so you don't forget. This is great because then you're going to make sure you're not applying it to the exact same roots too heavily. But basically we're looking at every 3 weeks or so. And so for a lot of our crops, 6 to 8 weeks might be the whole season. And so that might mean just once or twice that we're fertilizing. Some of the longer season crops, a great example is carrots. They might take up to 4 months to mature. And so you might be looking at several more applications of that. Whatever you do, always read the label and do as the label instructs in terms of volume per square foot and frequency. If it has a very different frequency, keep in mind that this 3 weeks I'm mentioning is a general rule. And so if it says specifically something else, to follow that. And I have a question about this. This person has asked questions, already used the soil to plant veggies and has got best results ever. It's great. I did it with a Miracle Grow bag of planting mix for veggies. Do I need to be worried that you've poisoned them? No, I don't think so at all. I would, because I have no idea what the mix was, I would assume it's safe. But if you have the bag, or you can refer to, you can look it up again online and look at the manufacturer's label. The only thing we ever worry about is if anything was a weed and feed product. Those we don't ever recommend because the feed part's great, that's the fertilizer. The weed part implies an herbicide, which would kill weeds. If it had that, I don't think you would have had good results. So I think you're probably safe. But since I don't have the label in front of me, I can't be 100% sure, but I have no reason to believe that they've been poisoned. So you should not be concerned. It doesn't sound like there's anything to be worried about. All right, organic fertilizer. So that's a big question. People always ask, is organic better? Do I have to use organic? It's up to you. Some people feel very strongly for environmental reasons, personal reasons, that organic is the way they're going to go. Organic is better in a couple of ways. Number one, they release nutrients more slowly. And so there's less chance that you're going to burn your plants if you over apply, for example. And there's not no chance. You can still overdo it with organics, but there's less of a chance. There's less of a chance they're going to pollute the water, with runoff, just because there's lower nutrients and they release them more slowly. And they're also made usually from some recycled process from plant or animal resources, compost. And so, there's that built-in environmental benefit. But what's great about it is, here's what's not great. They're more expensive. That's what's not great. But the good side of that is that they do release those nutrients over a longer period of time more naturally. And so you're getting more bang for your buck, so to speak. I think in the end, you're going to probably end up spending about the same amount. The synthetic fertilizers are generally cheaper, but they don't last as long. The organic are generally more expensive, but they generally last longer. And so really, it's almost always comes down to a personal preference. And frankly, these days, what's available. And that's just the fact that sometimes things are hard to find. Okay, so you've planned all this stuff out. Y'all are going to be busy in the next couple of weeks planning. You're going to be busy digging and building and composting in July, right? Hopefully the weather will hold out so you can get all that stuff ready. But then what? What are you planting, right? So here are the next two slides are what of the common vegetables, the popular ones, what can you grow in the fall? And these are for an August, September planting, what you see here. Lots of beans, onions, broccoli, peppers, tomatoes, eggplant, celery, collard, stuff like that. Some of these things can be started in July if you're going to start from seed as transplants. Don't put them out in the garden. They're not ready yet. It's too hot. But if you're going to start those transplants on that carport or on that patio, these things are, most of these you can start in July as seeds, then transplant them later. Oh, the other good thing I forgot to tell you by starting seeds like that is if you have poor germination, like maybe use an old bag of seeds and only half of them grew, now you can only transplant like the best, healthiest ones into the garden. And so that's kind of nice too. There's some more things I have here listed for the October, November planting time frame. And now we're going to start getting into those plants that like it when it's a little bit cooler. Things like your beets, Brussels sprouts, spinach, radishes, strawberries we can plant in October. And strawberries here are generally planted as an annual, and so they can be a little more expensive to grow, but they're fun. They don't do as well from seeds, so you generally have to get transplants for strawberries. Plant them out in October, harvest January, February, and then you pull the plants. So again, a little more expensive because when you're buying plants versus seeds, it costs more money. All right, so what about our resources? What is out there to help you besides me, which I'm always here to help you, and our program assistants and everyone? There's a couple of things, that fuzzy picture, which I blew up too big and it got fuzzy. Vegetable Gardening in Florida book that can be found online for about 17 bucks. It's a great comprehensive book. You can also find it for $0 at most of our local libraries if it's not too busy and popular. I think most of them have it, at least that I've been to. There is also an app, and these links, this will all be sent to you again afterwards. Jane's going to send you a PDF of all these, so you'll have these links, but that top one that says online is actually like an online app. They used to have it for the phone, and they don't have it for the phones anymore. I don't know why, but you can just pull it up on your computer, and you can put in your zip code, and it will tell you what you can grow right now, which is great. It'll tell you what you plant right now from seed, from transplant, how far apart. You can see it. You probably can't see it, it's really tiny, but it talks about planting dates. If you put your zip code in, it'll tell you by your zip code, how many plants to plant for every 10 feet, how many days to harvest, whether you plant from seed or transplant, all kinds of good info. It also tells you recommended varieties that are more successful here in Florida. And I will tell you, this is important. That list, either online or from the Florida Veggie Garden Guide, which is that bottom link you see, where it talks about recommended varieties, these are the ones that they've tested here in Florida. They can handle the pests, the diseases, the weird weather. You're going to have a lot more success using those. It doesn't mean you can't use other varieties. It just means you're going into uncharted territories. No one's tested them here. Even though they say they might grow here, they may not have as much success, or they might be susceptible to a disease that's a problem here. So really use those resources to pick the right varieties. And this is why we plan early, because if you show up at the big box store and you see the seeds they have, they're usually not the recommended varieties for here. I'm just going to be honest with you. There are some, but you're going to have a lot more success either at smaller local nurseries or online. There's a lot of seed stores and catalogs that are available online. And if you look and plan now, you'll have the seeds in plenty of time for planting. But if you wait till August, then you might have a little bit of a challenge. So that's why we're talking about it now in June. Trying to get to that next slide. I tell you what, here are some other resources. These are invaluable for you guys because you can call us, you can email us, you can even come by the help desk. Unfortunately, we're closed at lunch right now, and we're closed on all the same holidays that you guys are closed on, but you can come by with bugs from the garden or a sick plant or pictures of stuff, you can email us and we can help you the whole way through, even including planning this stuff. And I had a reminder for soil testing. So while you think of your questions, I'm going to go grab the soil test link so that you guys will know where to send your soil test to. They go right to Gainesville, right to the University of Florida, right to the mothership, as I like to say. And so you basically, what I'm going to put up as a link here, which I'm almost there, is a link to a PDF. It's a front and back, one page sheet on, here we go, soil test. It's the submission sheet and also the instructions on how to take the soil test. And it discusses how to do it from, I just put that in the chat box, how to do it in an in-ground area. You can also do it in a bed. And you can also do, if you've purchased soil, if you don't know. And I will tell you, we've had people purchase soil in large quantities, like several yards of soil delivered by truck that was supposed to be optimal for veggie gardening, and their pHs were very, very high. So even if you have gone to the expense of buying from a landscape supply company, special vegetable garden soil, if they don't have soil test results for that batch, I still recommend doing this, because if your pH is off, if it's off in the too high range, it's going to be very difficult to impossible to change it significantly and permanently. If it's too acidic, there are some things we can do to change it, but we really got to know what we're working with first. So look at that soil test sheet later. To send in a test just for pH, which is all you need, is only $3 a sample. So it's a very small investment to know what you're working with. They will make specific recommendations in that test based on your soil. And they also email me a copy of everyone's soil test. So if you get your soil test results and your eyes go cross-eyed and you have no idea what that means, my email will be on there and you can reach out to me and say, Teresa, what does that mean? I don't know what to do with this information. And so we're always here to help you. Are you still, oh, I just stopped share. Did everybody get the information they needed from there? Did I miss any questions? There was one I remember I have to go back to. In the meantime, if you have any other questions, please put them in the chat box. Well, I go back. There was a specific question. Here it is. I understand oleander is toxic. This is from Lisa. And of course, she didn't know that when she planted them 20 years ago. Most people don't know it still. Is the soil toxic after you dig them out? We'd like to plant some banana trees there. So oleander, the toxicity is in the plant parts, and it is something that you would need to ingest in order for that to be a problem. So as long as you're not going to ingest any of those plant parts, it would be safe to plant bananas there. I would like to check on one thing about oleander before I promise you that. So if you could, Lisa, if you're still there, if you could drop your email in like a private chat to me if you don't want everyone to see it, although you're probably, I could probably guess it, right, based on the county email. Let me write this down. Because there's something I want to look up. Some plants actually release compounds into the soil that will inhibit the growth of other plants. And I just want to double check. I don't believe oleander has this, but before I tell you it's perfectly great to do that, I want to double check on that. And so I want to email you that, that specifically later. Now, I'm not worried about the oleander plants leaving any toxicity in them that would then grow into the bananas and impart any poison into the bananas for you guys. That part is safe. I just want to make sure that there's nothing in the oleander that would prevent the bananas from growing successfully. All right, so, and I was right. So I will email you afterwards about that, Lisa, thank you. And let me see if there was another question here. Oh, okay, so Karen asked, how does a high pH affect the plants? Okay, well, you don't be sorry, you didn't miss it because I just told you that it did. I didn't tell you how. Okay, so for those who want to know how, there's a lovely chart and I don't have it handy, but plants, when they take up nutrients from the soil and that water column around the roots, there's a lot of chemical reactions that are taking place, and the pH of the soil and the water affect that. And the plants generally have a range For most plants, it's on the slightly acidic side. 7 is neutral. Anything over 7 is alkaline. Anything under 7 is acidic. Rain is generally supposed to be around that neutral 7 point if you don't have acid rain. What happens is certain plants, they have this range. And so at the optimal range, those chemical reactions are happening so they can take up all the nutrients. Once you go below or above that optimum range, you can fertilize till the cows come home and the plants can't take up those nutrients. So you can fertilize and fertilize and fertilize. If you have a pH of 8.5, the plants can't access those nutrients. And so what you end up with is very, very nutrient deficient plants that don't produce, they don't flower and fruit like they should. And sometimes they'll outright wilt and die because they can't access those nutrients. So that's why pH really matters. And the reason why high pH is even more problematic is if it's very high, over 7.5 for sure, there's almost nothing we can do to bring it down in a permanent sense. So we can add sulfur, and that can lower the pH in a temporary way. But if you have a really high pH, like coastal soil, you live near the beach, it's full of sand and little bits of seashell and limestone, and it's very high pH, which is very common. Even if you were to add a lot of organic matter and add sulfur all the time, it's never going to lower the pH in a long-term way. So that's an added expense and trouble and time. And so your follow-up question was, so that can vary for different veggies. It does, but not wildly. So our veggies are generally, our vegetable crops like it between 5.8 and about 6.5. So that's on the slightly acidic side. It can vary in the plant world in general, though. It varies wildly among different other crops, like blueberries, like a very acidic soil, much more acidic than the vegetable garden. And some of our native plants that's grown in a soil tolerate and thrive in a higher alkaline pH. But most of the vegetables, we're really talking about a lower, more acidic pH. And then that's not going to vary wildly within your veggie garden. So if your pH is, say, 6.3 in that range, you're good for pretty much all your vegetable crops. Hopefully that answered your question. Do I see any other questions here? I don't see any other questions so far. Does anyone have any last minute questions as we are winding down? I see a hand up. Did we already address your question, Karen? Or is that a new one?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay. So I was the one that put in that I had gotten that topsoil that was a load of it delivered that my husband had purchased. And so I used that for the garden bed and I mixed it in. And I know it was confusing when I put this in the chat. I mixed it in with like a Miracle-Gro for veggies potting mix, sort of. So I put them together. Now I have got the best results I've ever had for growing. And I never tested the stuff for pH because I didn't know about that, but I'm getting pretty good results. So I didn't know. So now I'm concerned that that's why I was concerned. I hope I didn't poison myself if there was something wrong with the soil that got delivered.
No, I mean, I would not assume that in any way. The only times we're worrying about poisoning ourselves is if we were to get soil that was contaminated. So I don't love ordering topsoil since we don't exactly know where it's from, right? Yeah. I don't love planting in the ground anywhere where there is previous industrial commercial activities because you don't know what was in the soil. At the same time, I don't want you to like freak out and assume there's anything wrong. The key here is you don't know exactly where it came from. You're never going to be 100% certain, right? I can't really say for sure. If you wanted to have that soil tested, the testing that we do, that university test does, is for pH, and you can also add on there extra nutrient testing, but it can't test for contaminants.
Okay.
So that's the trouble. If you need soil tested for contaminants, like if you suspected lead or arsenic or something of that nature, then you'd have to go to a private soil testing lab. And they run each test per contaminant, and they could be hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars to test the soil. So a couple of things you could do short of that would, if you're concerned, and for a lot of people, it's just like, oh, well, it's probably fine. Most of it's not going to take up. You just don't know. I can't promise, right? But what you can do is if you can follow up with the person that supplied the soil, you could ask them if they know where it came from.
Okay.
They may not. And if you're really truly concerned about contamination, since you don't know the source of the soil, it might not be a bad idea to start fresh again.
Well, I've already eaten some of the veggies. Thank goodness I haven't gotten that much, but I've definitely gotten better growth this time than I ever have. But
Yeah.
I'm in really sandy soil where I am, so I did a raised garden bed. And like I
Yes.
said, I mixed the soil because I was like, all right, I need something because it's just nothing's growing in the sand.
No, nothing will grow in the sand. Nothing like that will grow in the sand. Some of our herbs do pretty well in our sandy soils though. So if you, let's say you just really want to you want to stick something in the sand, think about herbs, because they're very tolerant, and a lot of our herbs are from Mediterranean drier climates, and they like that well-drained soil. So if you decide, like, I'm not going to spend any money and I just want to stick it in the ground, herbs are a good way to go. But yeah, I would follow up and see if you can see where that soil is from.
Okay.
If possible. Again, I just feel like it's one of those things where, like, most people grow in soils they don't ever test, they don't know. Probably fine.
Yeah.
But if you are deeply concerned about it, it wouldn't necessarily be harmful to dig it out, throw it in the ornamental areas, and start with fresh soil that you know where it came from.
Okay.
But
all right, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, the soil contamination thing is always a question that comes up, especially as urban as our county is. A lot of people live in areas of mixed commercial industrial uses. We've even had some small farms come to us and say, "Oh, we're gonna plant a farm, but it used to be a tire factory," and you're like, "Oh, okay." So now I have concerns, right? And we generally really often just tell folks that between the soil testing costs on a large scale like that, or and the question of the crummy sandy soil, it's just better to go ahead and build raised beds, line them, and start with fresh soil that's clean and safe. So,
okay, all right, thank you.
You're very welcome. Any other questions from the group? It's almost time. You can always email me. I'll drop my personal one in the chat, which you guys can guess too, if you saw my name. If I can type fast enough. And then you can always email us too at hort, H-O-R-T, at, and then pinellescounty.org, and also Garden Help. Sometimes that's easier to remember. Those are two other ones, and they all end in pinellescounty.org. And all of us will answer your questions. You can even email us pictures of your plant that's struggling.